Hi, I'm Eemeli, and I have this small hobby project that I'm doing sort of on the side for fun. I'm trying to fix localization in JavaScript. It's the small thing, but I've been at this for a while for fun, which is kind of a weird thing to do. The point here that what I want to get across to you is that localization is a thing where you have options, where you have all sorts of different ways you could be doing what you're doing. How do you get your text to show up as a part of your app? How do you include the strings you're getting from somewhere? And especially, how do you do that when you're dealing with multiple locales for which you need data? Most of us end up writing an app first in one language with the strings, and then you make some sort of choices. You end up needing at some point to bring in a second language. Hi, this is Finland. We're a bilingual country, and we all speak English. So this is a relatively irrelevant problem for many of us here in Finland, but it's a relevant problem all over the place, especially when you start building your thing, whatever the thing is, and it becomes a big thing in the end. And what you've ended up doing is making a series of compromises and decisions along the way. And those influence where you end up. And especially with localization, you end up making compromises that you don't necessarily realize that you've made. Because localization and internationalization are, at least in the general case, as problems, they're really hard. But most of the time, when you're doing just this specific app, you can get away with some really, really simple stuff, and they are sufficient. But what I'd like to have you at least think about here is that these are decisions that you can question. You can do different things. To start with, most of the time when you've got string data in JavaScript, you end up putting it in JSON format, because it sort of seems sensible. You can have it working on the client and in the back end, and it just works. But when you actually take JSON and you put it in front of someone who's not a JavaScript developer, especially who's not a developer at all, it's not really necessarily the most human way of having that information be handled there. There are other data formats that you can consider. I like YAML. There are issues with YAML, but that's by no means the only choice. Java's .properties file format is actually really quite good. I mean, it's mainly used, in fact, at a certain level for localization properties. And if you go back a little ways, getText and the .po file format used for that are thought out. This is really good for internationalization and localization. And how you're keeping your data is actually ends up mattering. How easy it is to do updates to the data. How easy it is to integrate the workflow that includes your translators eventually. Because translators are not developers. Sometimes developers are translators. But you have to end up realizing, I work as a consultant. In many different projects, we end up with different sorts of translation companies and translation solutions providing us with the localization text we use. And most of the people that work in translating, most of the time, those people are not working on translating UI or UX stuff. They're not used to the sorts of language and sorts of structures and variables coming in. And it's all, most of the time, you end up working with translators who are relatively new at what they're doing. Most of their job is translating bigger chunks of text, other things. And this is something you should think about, the whole workflow of how text works, what goes on behind the scenes. And again, it's one of those, you end up with one solution no matter what. And you might not actively realize that there are plenty of other options for how to do that. And there's many other, there's the different formats within how the data is structured. How do you handle, oh good grief, pluralization. Pluralization is not a problem that you realize is as complicated as it is. That sentence was more complicated than it needed to be. Pluralization, one talk, two talks. Sounds simple. It's relatively the same in Finnish and in English, for instance. It's relatively the same in quite a few other languages. But have you considered, for example, that yes, it is one talk, but it's 1.0 talks? Stuff like this just expands, and now we're talking only English, really, as an example. You go on to other languages. Russian has, I don't remember how many pluralization cases, but many. Sorry? Really? Yeah. Let's not get into this. I think there are actually 4. It's complicated. Luckily, we have other people thinking about that. And chat, sorry. Yeah. Yeah. And you don't need to worry about it most of the time. And most of the time you don't, because you end up just working with it. Quite often when you start out with a really simple solution for how you do localization, you start out with just normal string replacement for variables, and then you end up building from there. But it pays off to actually think about this at some stage. And pick a solution, because there are quite a few different solutions. And then, to actually bring this into the context of React, where we've not been yet, there are different solutions for what sort of an API you end up having at the React level, JSX sort of level, of how do you want to write code so it ends up being replaced by a string at some point and showing up as part of your app or site or whatever. You can have components that take in an ID. Here, this one is taking, it's going to look up a string, look up using the key API.options, some value, some string, or some function that takes in a parameter that we're then passing in as well and going from there. And there are other options as well, like, say, render props, if you want to use render props, if that seems to make sense in your case. This is an API choice that you can make and say, I want this to work that way. And there are plenty of other options as well. I'm amused by the previous talk and it mentioning profit from React context and mentioning internationalization. A week ago, I did a talk that was called using the new context API for fun and profit. That was focusing on the internationalization part of what's possible now with it. And there are a couple of other options. And the point here is that you can make these choices before you figure out, you can figure out how would you like it to work for localization. Because with JavaScript, we're all sort of now converged or converging on what JavaScript looks like. There's a process, how the new standards and different stages of stuff coming in. And we're no longer dealing in a world where we have JavaScript and CoffeeScript and all sorts of options. However, this is not the case for style sheets. Is it CSS modules, JSS, style components, just style objects? How do you do CSS? Lots of different options. No really one correct answer. And it's even worse for localization, because there isn't, it's not a problem that's so much on the surface, like styling components is, but it is a very widely done thing. So there are a number of different solutions for it. Some of the biggest React Intel and React I18 Next are some of the possibly most used bindings for React. Those are based on the format.js and the I18 Next sort of ecosystems. I'm one of the core developers of message format, one alternative to these, and the talk I gave a week ago was on React Message Context, which is a small context API library on top of that does provide some of these interfaces. But the important thing here is that there are these options. And these are not options that everyone is considering. They are options that are important for everyone. And that means that the guys behind these projects who are working on these, possibly even getting paid for it, I'm not, but still, they're sort of hungry for attention. If you have an idea of how you think localization should work in your case, how would you like a workflow to work? Whether you would like to have stuff happen more during the build time of your app rather than during the runtime. And there's an audience here of people who are working on this, who are effectively in some way, yes, we are open source, but still competing with each other for attention, for ideas. You can go and complain at them, us, and say, I would like this to work. Please make this work. If you don't make this work, I'm going to get those other guys to make it work for me. So have a think about localization. It's a thing that you are doing, or at least I hope you're doing, and it's important. And we can always get better at this, because we have not come up with the one correct solution for it, at least yet. And we probably will not. But we can get better. And with your help, we can all get better. Thank you.